Book of Nehemiah, in chapter 1, it says, "And they said unto me, the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire." We're living in a time of great decay and a time of peril in our country and throughout the whole world. Many say there is no hope. We see many signs that say the end is near. But the end is not near. I believe the beginning is near. And we're providentially blessed today to have a fellow and exemplary laborer among us, one who has worked faithfully and diligently for years, one of the remnant working on the walls, brick by brick, laying solid foundation, layer upon layer. A man who looks to the day when the burned gates are to be fully brilliant again, and a day when righteousness reigns throughout the whole earth. Mr. Scott's grasp of history and the players involved is, to my mind, unmatched today. His ability to clarify cause and effect is most sober, but also most useful. His books, to me, are worthy of being declared a national treasury. I can only hope and pray that more great works will come from his labors in hand. As for today, fellow laborers, I'm very honored indeed to introduce to you all Mr. Otto Scott.
Thank you very much, and good morning. Family and history. Big subject. Macaulay, the great English historian, used the word race in writing about families. He referred in his descriptions of the first Duke of Marlborough to the Churchill race, which incidentally he didn't think very much of, for various very good reasons. Now, calling families little races is not, when you look at it, very far off the mark. One notices physical types and even talents recurring in families through the generations. And such observations may no longer be fashionable, but they are unmistakable. The family in history, however, is so ubiquitous, so omnipresent, that it becomes very difficult to abstract and define. We can move into the subject best by indirection. Because societies are composed of families, we can examine families best, I think, by looking at societies. And these began, according to all historians, when people lived by husbandry and agriculture in clusters or tribes. And there are gaps in the record. We don't know, for instance, when the shift was made from the land to the village and from the village to the cities. All we know is that many generations passed before that sequence occurred. The first early towns were no more than a few streets huddled around a temple or a palace. And the physical landscape of plains and trees and rivers continued to dominate the village. The country towns remained mostly country. And for long periods, the village and the town retained strong bonds to the traditional culture, much as the small cities of the Middle Ages reflected the established Christian principles of the new Christian civilization that rose from the ashes of paganism. But as the cities expanded, they became centers of something else, of ideas and movements that replaced earlier values. The intellect began to resist the traditions of the culture. Intellectuals appeared who became conscious of their own separate existence. They were called humanists in the Renaissance, individuals who began to lead separated lives but also to talk about the people, meaning the people of the city. Spengler said the urban intellect reforms the great religions of the springtime and sets up by the side of the old religion of noble and priest the new religion of the third estate, liberal science. The city then begins to control the economy by replacing the old values of the land, introduce the idea of money as distinct from goods. The old agricultural barter is exchanged for monetary values. The ancient caravan or the warlike expedition implying barter or booty gives way to trade. And finally, as this process lengthens and includes immense numbers of people, we see the emergence of cities as world centers. A handful of gigantic places in each civilization disfranchises and disvalues the entire motherland of its own culture under the contemptuous name of the provinces. Much as the first editor of the New Yorker magazine said, it was not for the little old lady in Dubuque. When that stage arrives, there are no longer nobles and the middle class, believers and unbelievers, but only provincials and cosmopolitans. The most frequently cited examples of this are Babylon, whose huge rectangular blocks surrounded Herodotus and Thebes in ancient Egypt, or Rhodes and Alexandria later. And it was from this sort of world city that Abraham fled, leaving behind the urbanized masses of Ur. And we see in this view of the past and the present rising before our eyes 80 years ago, writing amid the world capital cities of Berlin and Paris, London and New York, Spengler, author of an immense history, said that by the year 2000 he could foresee cities laid out for 10 or 20 million inhabitants, spread over enormous areas of countryside, with buildings that would dwarf those of his time. He was writing in 1917 and 1918. Notions of traffic and communications that the people of his day would regard as fantastic. He was describing Cairo today with 20 million, Mexico City with at least another 20 million, and the urban belt that stretches from Boston to Washington in the east, continuously populated by tens of millions, and its counterpart in other regions. Over half of all Americans today live within 50 miles of our borders along the Atlantic and the Pacific, the Gulf, or the lake coast. The agricultural center of the country is becoming increasingly depopulated. And the process has been very rapid here, much more rapid than in ancient times. In the year 74 AD, for instance, Rome occupied only 12 miles. After that, its structures, like those of modern New York, were increasingly vertical. The Roman tenements rose to heights only achieved in the United States in a few places by the year 1900. People were huddled miserably together. Everyone wanted to be an urbanite. In all civilizations, the metropolis becomes man's creation, alien to the land, hostile to tradition. Cities become planned as in Peter the Great's St. Petersburg, or modern Brasilia, created in the interior of Brazil, situated on a barren plain with government structures and grid-like apartment houses built first, and then people transported by decree from Rio into Brasilia. In time, all great civilizations become city-oriented. People become so accustomed to the city that they become unaware of how bizarre a city really is, how strange it is that people should walk on stone and cement, overshadowed by giant buildings along streets teeming with vehicles. The city culture creates the illusion of anonymity. One is swallowed up in the crowd. Time magazine publishes an Easter issue saying that God is dead. In the country, families were once extended and all the children were once useful. For aeons, there was a continuity of not only the seasons but of the generations. The city separates all that, breaks it down. The Industrial Revolution, which led to families being driven off the land, off the common lands of England and Scotland, forced the people into the cities and then into the mines and factories, laid down the pattern that was then followed by all Europe and eventually the United States. Families were uprooted from the land, left the ancestral cemetery and church, began to lose their faith, turned toward the new gods of money, school, and jobs, turned from the Bible to the government, from eternity to careers. This is a very old sequence. Every civilization has undergone this change. People crowd into the city where the relationships between the sexes changes. Much admiration has been wasted on the 4th and 5th century BC Athens. It has been described as an ideal society despite its slavery. Dr. Rushdoony referred to it last night. It was a society where an Athenian speaker appealed to a jury by saying that we have call girls, hetera, for the sake of pleasure, mistresses for the daily refreshments of our bodies, but wives to bear us legitimate children and to look after the house faithfully. Athens, on the other hand, segregated women, deprived them of all legal rights, including the right to own or control property, the right even to leave the home excepting on certain feast days and then only if accompanied. If strangers visited, the women had to retreat to the private quarters upstairs. Only poor working women were seen outside the home. The system was very similar to modern Islam. The Athenian society established male gatherings as of supreme importance and placed public life as the center of attention, away from the family and toward the community. And therefore there were magnificent festivals and displays, great public buildings for political and religious purposes. And it was in those settings that the men spent their time. Their homes, in comparison, were modest and unimpressive. Marriage in such a culture was a matter of inheritance and limited within a close circle of relatives in order to preserve the family holdings. The same reason led to strict limitations on the number of legal children. Sparta, an exception, made women free. There they could inherit land in their own right. Until the 3rd century they owned 2/5 of the land, which led to a political revolution. On the other hand, Sparta denied the women the status of mothers. Children in Sparta were denied even the knowledge of their parents and parents of their children. The Spartans believed in government child care and thereby created emotional monsters. And once again we find a progression in antiquity that explains our presence. Originally, children were accepted as natural, as part of God's providence against the uncertain future, as loving companions against a barren old age. A change in that acceptance of life comes when the value of children are questioned. That question alone makes life questionable. And it's at that point, one might say at the urban point, that abortions by various means becomes common. Polybius deplored abortions as the ruin of Greece, but it was old in the great cities of his time. It was commonplace in Rome. It was excused at first as a result of the economy. It was said that people couldn't afford children, that they had become too expensive. But after a time, explanations were dropped. Abortions came to be considered normal, as in the Soviet today, where the average woman has had 7. This sequence appeared in Babylon, in Buddhist India. Men began to speak of their fiancées not as the future mothers of their children, but as companions. And today the Ibsen idea of marriage as a companionship is accepted generally. Bloodless relationships cut off from the past and the future. Bernard Shaw, the Irish clown, said that, quote, "Unless a woman repudiates her womanliness, her duty to her husband, to her children, to society, to the law, and to everyone but herself, she cannot emancipate herself," end quote. Similar arguments appeared in Greece, Rome, and India, and it's at that stage that the great cultural pyramid begins to collapse. It crumbles, said one historian, at the summit, first in the world cities, then in the provincial forms, and finally in the land itself, where the best blood has poured into the cities merely to bolster them up for a while. That's the final fall, which leaves only a landscape where nothing but the fellaheen remain. The masses, in other words, and the despots. Some modern commentators think that such a collapse can be traced to economic error, as though successive civilizations couldn't handle their money properly. But that's a simplification. It's also a humanist explanation. Of course, errors were made. Everything man does is riddled with error at all times. But there's more to decay than that. Solzhenitsyn cites an elderly peasant woman who was asked why old Russia, over 1,000 years old, collapsed. She said people forgot God. It wasn't money or technology or even war. The Roman Imperium enjoyed peace. It was rich. It had marvelously gifted engineers and architects, painters and poets, lawyers and merchants. Gibbon describes the northern shores of the Mediterranean where palaces with their swimming pools and gardens and baths and heated floors and servants and marble stretched for hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of miles, palace after palace after palace. Despite later opinions, the emperors from Nerva to Marcus Aurelius were excellent administrators, and yet the population dwindled. Augustus enacted such strict marriage and children laws in which the state would take away the whole inheritance of the childless, which led to wholesale adoptions. Barbarian soldiers were paid off in homestead land. Great charities were created for poor children, but nothing stopped the disappearance of the people. First in Italy, then in North Africa and Gaul, and finally even Spain which had been the most densely populated country in the empire, became empty and desolate. In desperation, Pertinax, in 193 AD, made it legal for anyone to take possession of any untended land if he brought it under cultivation. But that didn't help. People remained huddled in the cities where they could watch the games, enjoy the municipal baths, collect rations for their food, and live through political connections. I recall being driven around Rouen, France in the early 70s. My companion pointed out the deserted farmhouses where the farmers had simply walked away and gone into the city to work in the factories or the shops or to live on welfare. France, he said, he had too much land and not enough people. On the eve of the revolution in 1789, France was the greatest nation in Europe with the most land and the largest population. It had 25 million, to England's 5 million, to Spain's 7 million. By World War I, its population had fallen far behind Germany and had been overtaken by England. And the same phenomenon can be seen in the history of Egypt from the 19th dynasty before Jesus onward. Street widths grew narrow. The invasion of the sea people was barely repulsed. Finally, the Libyans seized power in 945 BC. And Egypt by then was several thousand years old. Very few historians have looked deeply into the decline of populations. It's almost as though they're afraid of what they might find. It's often said that the French birth rate began to decline after the Napoleonic Wars. But the fact is that most of the old families were not destroyed in the Revolution, but they stopped having children after 1815. And their sterility spread to the middle class, and since 1870 to all ranks of the French people. A similar trend became discernible in old American families, to such an extent that Theodore Roosevelt at the turn of the century denounced what he called race suicide. And since then, the shift of influence from WASPs to what has been euphemistically termed ethnic groups has been ascribed to a variety of causes, but conspicuously not to birth control, and never to the falling away of the vitality of mainline Protestantism, and certainly not to the increase of male and female inversion. Historians in more robust periods, however, had no hesitation in calling homosexuals the vultures of civilization, and pointed out that their appearance in large numbers is a sinister symptom of cultural decay. Now, no modern study has been necessary to make these observations. No polls of the man and the woman in the street, no special foundation grants, no research projects. The evidence is cumulative, gathered from thousands of years of experience of people living in all corners of the globe. In place after place, in time after time, we discover that provincial cities collapsed at an early stage, much as many of the smaller cities in inland America are slowly dwindling, to be followed by the implosion of the large metropolis. One watches the street gangs of LA and even Washington, D.C., of Detroit and New York, all as unsafe at night as Rome was in its time of decay, with a sense that more than drugs are at work, that deeper forces are welling up from the city pavements. One is reminded that Samara was abandoned in the 10th century, that Pataliputra in India was, quote, an immense and completely uninhabited waste of houses when the Chinese traveler visited it about 625 AD. Many of the great Mayan cities were already abandoned in the jungle when Cortez arrived. nearly 900 years later. The Spanish conqueror came upon a dying people in Central America. Quote, in a long series of classical writers from Polybius onward, we read of old renowned cities in which the streets have become lines of empty, crumbling shells, where the cattle browse in forum and gymnasium, and the amphitheater is a sown field dotted with emergent statues. Rome had, in the 3rd century of our era, the population of a village, but its imperial palaces were still habitable. End quote. We read that in the library, and then we emerge to watch the silent exodus of first the wealthy and now the middle classes from our cities, not to the suburbs, but to the country, far from the dangers of Chicago, New York, and Detroit, to the elderly enclaves, complete with walls and guards and clinics in the sun country, leisure villages, soon to become plaster tombs, with a sense that something deeper and more significant than real estate values are at work. At this point, I'm sure somebody will point out, or at least think, that modern science in all its facets, medical and industrial, mechanical and biological, has extended lifespans and reduced infant mortality, has saved the lives of mothers and increased the population of the world. The globe today contains, we're told, about 5 billion people. When I was 10 years old, it was 2 billion. By the year 2000 AD, a third of all the people on Earth are expected to live in cities of over 100,000 inhabitants. Tokyo is expected to harbor 26 million. Lagos, Nigeria, 9.4 billion. Mexico City, 31 million. Sao Paulo, Brazil, a city that most Americans have never heard of, 27 million. Experts expect to see 100 cities, all the size of ancient Rome, and many larger. This trend, in terms of population and cities, does not contradict the history of cities and cultures. It merely underscores the importance of the past. For the past is the record of man's time and activities on earth, the record of what has worked and what has failed. The city of Rome is estimated to have had a population of about 2 million during the first 3 centuries AD. The empire of population of about 60 million. Egypt is estimated to have had about 7.5 million people. These are figures for the time of Julius the Great Caesar. Other millions teemed along the Mediterranean. The descendants of all those millions vanished when they drifted from reality and forgot that we are not on earth to avoid challenge, to live without pain, or to live for ourselves alone. The ancient civilizations of which we have records died, as we know, of their excesses and in despair. They had lost their faith, and history knows of no civilization that has ever risen without a faith, and no civilization has ever outlasted the loss of its faith. We trace these losses in the rise of cities and the kind of reasoning that appears in city-dominated cultures. And that's not because I've forgotten that this is a conference on the family, but because families are subject to the tides of society. Those who swim in these tides should understand how to navigate them and how not to be drowned in them. There is no need for millions to return to the land when agriculture has become so advanced a science that farming can be maintained by a minority of the population. But there is a great need to understand the dangers to any civilization and abstract reasoning that separates people from reality. It's not original to cite these dangers. When the Greek civilization was young and virile, And when homosexuality was a capital offense, when its families were healthy and its morals and courage was firm, when Homer told the tale of Odysseus, whose name means man of pain, the lesson was known. Odysseus, you'll recall, was washed by a storm onto the shores of a remote island called Shari, the land of security, occupied by a people called the Phaeacians. At a time when neither Athens or Ithaca or Sparta had walls, the Phaeacians lived behind high walls in perfect peace, far from the world. They didn't hunt, they had neither bows nor arrows, but they had marvelous ships that traveled with the speed of thought. And that gives us a hint of the unworldly. And as the poem continues, we gradually learn that Odysseus has landed in the first utopia ever described in Western literature. Other details fill in the picture. The doors of the palace were gold with silver posts guarded by immortal watchdogs made of gold and silver. There were thousands of mechanical servants and orchards of pears and apples, figs and olives that never ceased to bear. The Phaeacians enjoyed all the blessings of life and none of its pain. Their musicians and poets told only about the struggles of other people in other lands. They lived, in other words, at one remote, as spectators, much as some of us experience the vicissitudes of life through television. It was beautiful but unreal, and Odysseus wanted to get home to Ithaca, to his wife and to his family, to his own house, his own problem, and his own kingdom. So the Phaeacians gave him one of their magic boats and many gifts, and in this space of a single bird's beat of a wing, he was back in Ithaca. All that Homer has to say about the Phaeacians after that in the Odyssey is that Poseidon, the sea god who had created their remote utopia for them, grew tired of them and destroyed them all in a single tidal wave. And because they had never accomplished anything for themselves, had neither suffered nor gained nor lost, nor really ever lived, the Phaeacians left no record, no trace, and no memory of their existence. Now, some idea of the distance that the Greeks traveled in terms of culture can be seen when we compare that ancient contempt for the idea of an earthly paradise with Plato's Republic, with its guardians who governed everyone, who held women in common, and whose children were not to know their fathers or their mothers. Plato, with his idea that people should go naked in summer, is congenial to the modern mind, which has traveled the same course that I have just traced from Homer to 5th century Athens. Unlike Plato or Sir Thomas More, who coined the term utopia in 1516, Homer did not see his earthly paradise as a fit goal for men. But the idea of a perfect world here and now has been floating in the air ever since Plato, 2,500 years ago. In the last 2 centuries, it has moved from the top to the middle of society and captivated a whole variety of ambitious educators, professionals, social scientists, politicians. Of course, man has always tried to improve his environment through fire, through metalworking, instruments, weapons, plows, boats, houses, animal training, above all the metals. Our civilization, the Christian civilization, from the age of Constantine until now has gone farther and deeper than any other in these efforts. Spengler considered that modern man had made a Faustian bargain with the devil, and to have agreed to give up his soul for the mastery of the world. He traces this effort from the cells of Gothic monks engaged in what Roger Bacon calls scientia experimentalis, who studied cosmic laws in order to overpower them. And this led to the idea of the machine as a small cosmos, obeying the will of man alone. Movable types, the telescope, the microscope, the steam engine, which tied nature to the yoke as a slave, described as though in contempt in terms of horsepower. Since then, immense strides have been made. Basic nuclear elements have been combined to create power too immense to compare to anything else. We have planes that fly faster than the speed of sound, computers that add and subtract unimaginable quantities. And in this new world of giant forces, unseen and unseeable, held together by minds, built by specialists in the service of professionals, speaking languages understood only within their own ranks, life seems both abstract and governable. It seems not simply centuries but aeons removed from those periods of history that were dominated by families, and when our artists and poets, writers and priests, people and kings saw in the Holy Family the heavenly image of our families on earth under the living God. It's easy in the time of the machine to begin to think in the abstract, to begin to believe that all things are possible through reason. As the city culture grew abstract, Paris exploded in the illusions of a new civilization created by thought alone, without religion, using only the power of the state. We've seen that same attempt rise again in the name of socialism, Marxism, welfarism, again and again. In these efforts not yet ended, perhaps they will never really end, the family becomes in each occasion and with each try a target. Everything I've said so far is merely a prelude to the family situation today, just as all history is a record of the past upon whose shoulders we stand. Later today, I'll look with you at our contemporary situation, at who and what is responsible, how and why we must overcome its challenge. Thank you.